There's a quiet truth about children who grow up emotionally invalidated. They often become adults who struggle to believe their feelings matter at all. They walk into relationships wondering if their emotions are too much. They achieve success, but wait for it to be dismissed. They carry a deep belief that their inner world is somehow wrong. This isn't because they lack emotional intelligence. It happens because the foundation of their self-worth was built on constant invalidation. Psychologists call this an internalized invalidation schema. Over time, the brain learns to expect dismissal. It anticipates that emotions are burdens. A child who hears, "You're being too sensitive enough times," eventually stops feeling altogether. Recent research from Harvard's Center on the Developing Child reveals something startling. Children who experience consistent emotional invalidation show measurable changes in brain structure. The areas responsible for emotional regulation become hyperactive. Stress hormones flood their developing systems. Their nervous systems wire themselves for constant threat detection. But here's what makes this particularly devastating for families. Emotional invalidation doesn't look like abuse. It doesn't leave visible scars. Sometimes it's simply a parent who says, "Stop crying," when a child is hurt. Sometimes it's dismissing teenage emotions as just hormones. Sometimes it's the well-meaning parent who immediately jumps to solutions without acknowledging the feeling first. A study from the University of Minnesota followed families for 15 years. They discovered that children who experienced consistent emotional validation developed significantly higher emotional intelligence. They had better relationships. They showed greater resilience in facing life challenges. But children who grew up invalidated struggled with chronic self-doubt. They had difficulty trusting their own emotional responses. The hidden psychology of family invalidation. Most parents who invalidate their children's emotions don't do it intentionally. They often learn these patterns from their own childhood experiences. A father who was told, "Boys don't cry," might unconsciously pass that message to his son. A mother who learned to suppress her emotions might feel uncomfortable when her daughter expresses strong feelings. Dr. Marsha Linehan's research on emotional dysregulation shows us something crucial. Validation isn't about agreeing with every emotion. It's about acknowledging that the emotion exists and makes sense, given the person's experience. When parents consistently invalidate emotions, children learn that their internal world is fundamentally wrong. Consider what happens in a typical family scenario. A teenager comes home upset about a conflict with friends. The invalidating parent might say, "That's not a big deal," or "You're overreacting." The child's emotional experience gets dismissed. Their brain processes this as evidence that their feelings don't matter. But there's something even more subtle happening. Children develop what psychologists call emotional reasoning skills through validation. When a parent says, "I can see you're really hurt by what happened," the child learns to identify and name their emotions. They develop confidence in their emotional responses. They learn that feelings provide important information about their experiences. Research from Yale's Child Study Center demonstrates that emotional validation in childhood directly predicts emotional intelligence in adulthood. Children who receive consistent validation develop better stress management skills. They form healthier relationships. They make better decisions because they trust their emotional guidance systems. Pattern 1. The minimization trap. The first invalidation pattern parents fall into is emotional minimization. This happens when parents unconsciously dismiss the intensity of their child's experience. Phrases like, "It's not that bad," or "You'll get over it," might seem helpful, but they teach children that their emotional responses are inappropriate. Dr. Susan David's research at Harvard Medical School reveals how minimization affects emotional development. When children's emotions are consistently minimized, they learn to suppress their feelings. They develop what she calls emotional bottling. The emotions don't disappear. They go underground, often emerging later as anxiety, depression, or relationship difficulties. Let's examine a specific family scenario. 12-year-old Sarah comes home, crying because her best friend excluded her from a birthday party. Her father, wanting to help, says, "Don't worry about it. She's not a real friend anyway." His intention is protective, but Sarah's brain receives the message that her sadness is unnecessary. Her hurt feelings get invalidated. The neurological impact is measurable. Brain imaging studies show that emotional invalidation activates the same neural pathways as physical pain. When a parent minimizes a child's emotions, it literally hurts their developing brain. The child's stress response system becomes hypervigilant. They learn to expect emotional rejection. A healthier response would acknowledge Sarah's pain first. "That sounds really hurtful. Tell me more about what happened." This validates her emotional experience. It communicates that her feelings make sense. Only after validation should parents explore solutions or different perspectives. The long-term consequences of minimization extend far beyond childhood. Adults who grew up with invalidated emotions often struggle with emotional decision-making. They second-guess their instincts. They have difficulty setting boundaries because they don't trust their emotional responses. Research from Stanford University shows these adults are more likely to stay in unhealthy relationships and toxic work environments. Pattern 2. The comparison destroyer, the Seikazes. Second invalidation pattern involves emotional comparisons. Parents might say, "Your sister never complains about this," or "When I was your age, we didn't have these problems." These comparisons seem motivational, but they teach children that their unique emotional experiences are invalid. Developmental psychology research from UCLA demonstrates how comparisons damage identity formation. During adolescence, teenagers are developing their sense of self. When parents compare their emotions to others, it disrupts this crucial process. Teenagers learn to doubt their authentic responses. They start performing emotions they think are more acceptable. Consider 16-year-old Marcus, who feels overwhelmed by academic pressure. When he expresses anxiety about upcoming exams, his mother responds, "Your cousin Jake handles twice the coursework without complaining." Marcus's anxiety gets invalidated through comparison. His brain processes this as evidence that his stress response is wrong or weak. The psychological mechanism behind comparison, invalidation, is particularly damaging. Children naturally look to parents for emotional guidance. When parents suggest that other children handle situations better, it triggers shame responses. Neuroscientist Dr. Brené Brown's research shows that shame is one of the most destructive emotions for developing self-worth. Marcus's mother could validate his experience while still encouraging growth. Academic pressure can feel really overwhelming. It makes sense that you're feeling anxious. Let's talk about some strategies that might help you manage these feelings. This acknowledges his emotional reality while opening space for problem-solving. Brain imaging studies reveal that children who experience frequent emotional comparisons show increased activity in the anterior cingulate cortex. This brain region is associated with social rejection and emotional pain. Over time, these children develop heightened sensitivity to criticism. They become people pleasers, constantly monitoring others' emotions while ignoring their own. Pattern 3. The solution: jumping problem. Third invalidation pattern happens when parents immediately jump to solutions without validating emotions first. This seems helpful and efficient, but it teaches children that emotions are problems to be solved rather than information to be understood. Research from the University of Rochester shows that premature problem-solving prevents emotional processing. When children don't learn to sit with difficult emotions, they struggle with emotional regulation throughout life. They become adults who either avoid difficult feelings or become overwhelmed by them. Picture 14-year-old Emma telling her father about feeling left out at school. Before she finishes explaining her experience, he starts offering solutions. "Why don't you join the drama club? You could invite someone over this weekend. Maybe you should talk to your teacher." His intentions are loving, but Emma's emotional experience gets bypassed entirely. The neurological research is clear about why this matters. Emotional processing requires time and attention. When the prefrontal cortex acknowledges and processes emotions, it sends calming signals to the amygdala. This natural regulation process gets interrupted when parents jump immediately to solutions. Emma's brain needed to process the pain of social rejection first. Her father could have said, "Feeling left out is really painful. That must have been hard to experience today." This validation allows her nervous system to process the emotion. Only after emotional acknowledgement should solutions be explored. Dr. Daniel Siegel's research on adolescent brain development reveals why this pattern is particularly damaging during teenage years. The adolescent brain is developing emotional regulation capacities. When parents consistently bypass emotions for solutions, teenagers miss crucial learning opportunities. They enter adulthood without strong emotional processing skills. Adults who grew up with solution-jumping parents often struggle with decision-making. They never learn to use emotions as guidance systems. They either make impulsive decisions to avoid difficult feelings or become paralyzed by analysis because they don't trust their emotional wisdom. Pattern 4. The emotional shutdown. Response. Fourth invalidation pattern occurs when parents shut down emotional expression entirely. Phrases like, "Stop being so dramatic," or "Calm down right now" might temporarily end the emotional display. But they teach children that emotional expression is dangerous or unwelcome. Attachment research from the University of Virginia demonstrates the long-term impact of emotional shutdown responses. Children who learn to suppress emotions develop what psychologists call avoidant attachment patterns. They struggle with intimacy throughout life because they never learned that emotions create connection rather than disconnection. Imagine 10-year-old David having a meltdown after a frustrating day at school. His mother, overwhelmed by his intensity, says, "I can't deal with this right now. Go to your room until you can control yourself." David's emotions get labeled as too much, too overwhelming, fundamentally problematic. The neurobiological impact is significant. When children's emotions are repeatedly shut down, their nervous systems learn to associate emotional expression with abandonment. Dr. Stephen Porges' research on the polyvagal theory shows that these children develop hypervigilant nervous systems. They become adults who either suppress emotions entirely or have explosive emotional outbursts. A validating response would help David process his emotions while maintaining boundaries. "I can see you're having really big feelings right now. Let's take some deep breaths together and figure out what's happening." This approach validates his emotional experience while teaching regulation skills. Research from Harvard Medical School reveals that children who experience consistent emotional shutdown develop alexithymia, difficulty identifying and expressing emotions. As adults, they struggle with emotional intimacy. They have higher rates of anxiety and depression because they never learned healthy emotional processing strategies. Pattern 5. The positivity pressure. Fifth invalidation pattern involves pushing positive emotions over authentic ones. Parents might say, "Look on the bright side," or "Everything happens for a reason," when children express difficult emotions. This seems optimistic and helpful, but it teaches children that negative emotions are unacceptable. Dr. Barbara Fredrickson's research on emotional balance shows that emotional well-being requires the full range of human emotions. When parents consistently push positivity, children learn to suppress authentic responses. They develop what psychologists call toxic positivity, the inability to acknowledge or process difficult emotions. Consider 13-year-old Lily grieving the death of her pet. When she expresses sadness, her father says, "He's in a better place now. You should focus on the happy memories." Lily's grief gets invalidated in favor of manufactured positivity. Her brain learns that sadness is wrong or unhelpful. The psychological consequences extend far beyond childhood. Adults who grew up with positivity pressure often struggle with emotional authenticity. They present false positive facades while struggling internally. Research from the University of California, Berkeley shows these adults have higher rates of anxiety and depression. Lily's father could validate her grief while still offering comfort. It's really hard to lose someone you love. Your sadness shows how much he meant to you. Tell me about what you're feeling. This acknowledges her authentic emotional experience while creating space for natural healing. Neuroscience research reveals that suppressed emotions don't disappear. They create chronic stress responses in the body. Dr. Gabor Mate's work on emotional health demonstrates that emotional suppression contributes to various physical health problems, including autoimmune disorders and chronic pain. Integration framework, building emotional safety understanding. These invalidation patterns is the first step toward creating emotional safety in families. But change requires more than awareness. It demands a fundamental shift in how parents approach their children's emotional worlds. The key principle is simple, but revolutionary. Emotional validation means acknowledging that feelings exist and make sense given the person's experience. It doesn't mean agreeing with every emotion or action. It means recognizing emotions as valid information about a person's inner experience. Dr. John Gottman's research on family dynamics reveals that emotional validation is the foundation of healthy relationships. Families that practice emotional validation have significantly lower conflict rates. Children in these families develop stronger emotional intelligence. They show greater resilience in facing life challenges. But validation requires parents to manage their own emotional responses first. When a child expresses intense emotions, parents often feel triggered. Their own nervous systems activate. Without self-regulation skills, parents default to the invalidation patterns they learned in their own childhood. Research from the Center for Mindful Self-Compassion shows that parents who develop emotional regulation skills create more emotionally safe environments. They can stay present with their children's difficult emotions without becoming overwhelmed themselves. This presence is what allows genuine validation to occur. The transformation happens gradually. Each moment of validation builds trust between parent and child. Children learn that their emotions are welcome in the relationship. They develop confidence in their emotional responses. They learn to use emotions as guidance systems rather than threats to be managed. Comprehensive action plan for family transformation. Implementing emotional validation requires intentional practice and patience. Change doesn't happen overnight, but small consistent shifts create significant transformation over time. Week 1 focuses on awareness building. Parents should notice their automatic responses to children's emotions. When does the urge to minimize, compare, solve, shut down, or push positivity arise? Simply noticing these patterns without judgment creates space for new responses. Week 2 introduces the validation pause. Before responding to emotional expressions, parents take 3 deep breaths. This activates the prefrontal cortex and calms the nervous system. From this centered place, parents can choose validating responses rather than reacting from their own triggered states. Week 3 practices. Validation language. Parents learn phrases like, "That sounds really difficult. Tell me more about that." And "Your feelings make sense to me." These responses acknowledge the child's emotional reality without immediately moving to solutions or different perspectives. Week 4 integrates emotional conversations into daily family life. Parents create regular opportunities for emotional check-ins. They ask about feelings, validate responses, and model healthy emotional expression themselves. This normalizes emotions as important information rather than problems to solve. Long-term success requires ongoing commitment. Families should expect setbacks and practice self-compassion when old patterns resurface. Research shows that new neural pathways take approximately 6 months to become automatic, but the investment creates lasting positive change in family relationships. Children who grow up with emotional validation develop stronger self-esteem. They form healthier relationships. They make better decisions because they trust their emotional guidance systems. Most importantly, they learn to validate themselves, breaking generational cycles of emotional invalidation. Remember that healing is possible at any stage. Adults who grew up invalidated can learn to validate themselves and their children. Every moment of emotional validation creates ripples of positive change that extend far beyond the immediate family. The journey toward emotional health begins with the courage to acknowledge that feelings matter. They've always mattered, and they always will.